Okay, so today Reese and I are going to go through and we're going to look at solving quadratic equations by the completing the square. Okay? Alright, so when solving quadratic equations, remember the first thing we're always going to do is we're going to try to solve the quadratic equation by factoring. But, Risa, is every quadratic equation factorable?
No.
No, and so therefore we need other methods to solve, okay? And so one such method is completing the square. However, we're not going to use completing the square. We're going to factor if possible, and if we can't factor, then we'll use the quadratic formula. But the reason we're studying the completing the square today is so that you appreciate and understand where the quadratic formula comes from, okay? And the final thing is just remember, for all quadratic equations, we're always going to start in our general form, okay? All right, next page. So a few things about completing the square, okay? Again, as I said earlier, this is not something that we're probably going to do in the future, but it's going to allow us to understand where the quadratic formula comes from, okay? What else, Risa?
The beauty of adding zero.
Very good. And finally, we're going to have to be able to make perfect square trinomials, okay? All right, so let's warm up a little bit here. And we're going to look at making perfect square trinomials, okay? Risa, do you know what a perfect square trinomial is?
No.
Well, there it is right here. And what you're going to notice is that a perfect square trinomial will always factor down to a binomial squared, okay? But today, we're never going to have to deal with a number in front of our x squared. So our perfect square trinomials will be a little bit simpler, and they're always going to be just simply 1x squared. And so it'll always factor down to x plus or minus a number, okay? All right, so Risa, let's take a look at the first example. So what would we add to make x squared plus 4x a perfect square trinomial?
4.
Okay, very good. And can you explain to me how you knew it was 4?
I divided by 2 and then squared 4.
Very good. So 4 divided by 2, which is 2, and you square that and you get 4. And then Risa, what would this factor down to?
X plus 2 squared.
Very good. There we are. Okay, one more example. All right, so in this case, what are we going to add?
16.
Very good. And again, 8 divided by 2, which is 4, squared is 16. And what would this factor down to?
X minus 4 squared.
Okay. Now, before we move on, one thing I would like to just comment on is to factor a perfect square trinomial is really easy. Each of these three terms gives us one of these three things. Okay? Risa, what's the square root of x squared?
X.
Very good. What's the square root of 4?
2.
And the middle term, this determines the sign. If the middle term is plus, this is a plus. As we can see here, if the middle term is minus, this is a minus. Okay? All right, let's move on. So now we're going to solve quadratic equations that aren't going to require completing the square because they're going to already have a binomial squared. So let's take a look at them. All right, so here it is here. So for questions like this, it's kind of partly done for us. So we just want to get the x minus 3 squared by itself. So Risa, what are we going to do?
Divided by 2.
Okay, good. And what is 24 divided by 2?
12.
And then what happens to our two 2's over here?
Cancel it.
Very good. Okay. Now, at this point, Risa, what do we do?
Square root.
Okay, take the square root of both sides. Now, on the left-hand side, the squared and the square root, what happens there?
X minus 3.
Right, because the square root and the squared cancel. And then pretend that you don't see the answer here. We have to simplify the radical. So what is root 12 simplified?
2 root 3.
Very good. Okay, so here we are now. And at this point, what do we have to do to solve for x?
Move 3 to the right side.
Okay, very good. And when I do that, I'm going to put the 3 in the front, and I'm going to write x is equal to 3 plus or minus 2 root 3. Okay? And again, remember that this is two different answers. What are the two answers, Risa?
3 3 plus 2 root 3, 3 minus 2 root 3.
Very good. There are two different answers there. Okay? All right, let's do another example that's the same. Okay, what would you do first, Risa?
Divided by 3,
Okay, and after dividing by 3, we're going to do what?
square root.
Okay, good. So taking the square root. And very quickly, what's root 20 simplified?
2 root 5.
Very good. And so now we have x plus 4 equals plus or minus 2 root 5. And final answers, Risa?
X equals minus 4 plus minus 2 root 5.
Very good. Okay, simple enough. All right, in fact,
That was easy.
all right. Final example. Okay, this one's a little bit harder in the sense that now when you look inside this binomial, there's a little bit more going on with the x. But our first few steps aren't going to change. So what do we do first, Risa?
Divided by 2,
Okay. And what's 36 divided by 2?
18.
Okay. And again, at this point, what do we do?
Square root.
Right, we take the square root of both sides. And now, what's root 18 simplified?
3 root 2.
Okay, good. And so at this point, what we have is this. Now, there's going to be a few more steps, or I guess really only one more step here, because there's now a number or a coefficient in front of our x. Okay, so what would you do next, Risa?
Move 1.
Okay, so adding 1 to both sides. And now what do we do?
Divided by 3.
Very good. And so our final answers are 1 plus or minus 3 root 2 divided by 3. Okay? Are you ready to look at some completing the square examples, Risa?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Let's take a look.